right, here we go. I'm starting a little late today. Sorry about that. I've been running into all kinds of issues with Cubase today. Hopefully they won't persist. Hopefully my computer just works fine for the stream. If we start to have issues with Cubase, I'll just switch to Finale down here. We can use notation instead of MIDI data. But yes, welcome to the third live stream in this series. We're going to be doing, after last Tuesday, so just 2 days ago, we talked about writing for the string section. So today, we're going to talk about writing for the Woodwind section. We've got a couple different goals. Like last time, we're going to start by talking about the different strengths and uses of the Woodwind section. Then we'll kind of delve into each of the instruments, which there are quite a few instruments in the Woodwind section. So we won't go as in-depth as we did with the string section. However, that being said, as usual, I have all these notes right here, including the ranges, registers, and tone colors, which is going to be super important for today, because the Woodwinds, their single greatest strength is the sheer variety of tone colors that they have at play. So, we already got a question. All right, so Caleb, my very first question is, I hope you answer how to balance the timbre of different woodwinds because they all sound so different. Yes, that is going to be a huge part of today's conversation. We're going to talk about the different tone colors of the woodwind section, how their sounds get organized. And then we're going to dive into, there are 2 golden rules I'm going to teach you for whenever you're arranging for woodwinds. And after we go over those 2 golden rules, then we're going to take a look at 5 pretty typical uses for the woodwind section that you might find. Where are the triple reed instruments? That's a good question. I don't know if there are any triple reed. I don't think there are. My gut instinct says there are no triple reed instruments, but I don't know. I mean, the bagpipes have a ton of reeds, but that's almost like a collection of a bunch of double reeded instruments. But yeah, awesome. So finally got my last instrument loaded here, the contrabassoon. And that actually had me panicking a little bit because like 3 minutes before we were supposed to go live, my whole session crashed suddenly without reason. And I'm just setting up the reverb on this contrabassoon. And let's give it a test. All right, awesome. We have sound. We've got everything we need. So, wait a minute. So Sean, they say they exist, just not in the West. I would love to hear what a triple reeded instrument sounds like. That'd be awesome. Yeah, Sean, put in the name of a triple reed instrument in the comments. I want to look that up later. Thank you. I learned something new today. Now, today we are learning about the woodwind section, which is all these lovely, lovely instruments. And below here, we have all the good work we put in 2 days ago. Here we have the arrangement of Jack's short little piece. This piece to be, it's not short, there it is. This piece to be exact is what we arranged for strings last Tuesday in the last live stream. Let's give that a quick listen, and then we're going to dive right into the woodwinds. There we go. All right, so excellent. That's what we had last Tuesday. This is what we took our short idea, arranged it for strings. There were a couple moments there where you could hear my computer struggling. It's still kind of waking up today. Plus, it's just an old computer. I gotta upgrade someday when I can afford it. But For now, let's talk about the woodwind sections, at the risk of me just rambling about things again. Oh yeah, so we talked about this actually at the end of last stream. So the woodwinds, we talked about how the strings have two strengths, have two main strengths. We talked about how they have a homogeneous sound, meaning that each stringed instrument sounds similar to the others, and each stringed instrument everywhere in its range sounds very similar. So like the low end of a violin sounds very similar to the high end of the violin. There are of course differences, but compared to other instruments, there's not a dramatic change. And that's something we're really going to be talking about today, is about those other instruments. So the homogeneous sound and then the dynamic variability, which basically says that any stringed instruments can play anywhere from super, super soft to super, super loud, anywhere in their range. Now, why I'm bringing this up is because these two strengths do not exist in the woodwinds. The woodwinds have one primary strength and and this all comes down to variety. All right, the woodwinds have more tone colors in their one section than any of the other sections, but the one exception being percussion. Whenever I talk about the three main sections, I'm talking about brass, woodwinds, and strings. But of those three, the woodwinds by far have the largest breadth of tone colors. In fact, each of the instruments sounds so different from each other, in like contrasting to the strings, that they actually get divided into three different subsections, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But even between the different instruments, like the flutes sound very different from the single reeds. The single reeds sound very different from the double reeds. Even within these instruments, an oboe in its low register sounds very different from an oboe in its middle register, which sounds very different compared to the oboe in its upper register. It's the same way with all of the woodwinds. They have these morphing, beautiful, diverse sounds and tone colors. And this is the single greatest strength of the woodwinds. Now, the problem with this is if you don't understand how these tone colors work, if you don't understand where they change, how they change, and what kind of patterns they follow, then you're going to run into an issue where you're not really writing for the woodwinds as effectively as you can. You might write a line for the flute that just doesn't sound the way you wanted it to sound in your head, or when you wrote it on sheet music or in your DAW even. You find out that when the flute plays in its highest register, it doesn't have that sweet lyrical sound of a flute you were expecting it to have. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing we need to do is we need to learn about the woodwinds have three subsections. All right, and these subsections are divided based off the kind of what happens to their tone colors. So we have the flutes, we have the single reeds, and we have the double reeds. Now, in general, the flutes are the flutes, of course, and piccolo. And what makes a flute, other than the way it's built, what categorizes its sound is, as a flute moves higher in its range, the sound becomes sharper, more powerful, and more piercing. As it moves lower, it becomes weaker and less powerful, which I guess that's kind of redundant, weaker and less powerful. But the single reeds, like the clarinets, and the saxophones are also single-reeded instruments, but the saxophones aren't really included in most orchestras. They're a significantly more recent invention compared to other instruments in the orchestra, and they just never got kind of adopted in the same way that the others have. But the point of a single reed is very similar to the flutes in timbral impact, but less dramatic. All right, so yes, a clarinet does get more piercing, more powerful as it moves higher in its range, but not nearly to the same extent as a flute. We're going to talk about how the flute is a very dangerous instrument, and the piccolo especially are very dangerous instruments to spend too much time playing super high in their range for a couple of different reasons. The single reeds are similar. You don't want to spend too much time on their upper register, but they can still kind of they have a little more control. They don't have as dramatic as a difference. Now, the double reeds are kind of the odd man out. They get more powerful the lower in their range you move, and less powerful the higher you go. And so these are kind of like the patterns that establish the three different subgroups and these little subsections. It's going to be important because as we discuss different arranging strategies and approaches to writing for the Woodwind section, you need to be able to understand what are the tendencies of each of your instruments. Now, with this being said, let's start looking in some of the instruments. At this point, there are so many of them that I'm just going to kind of bring my notes on screen for you guys to all look at. The first one, of course, is the piccolo. Let me pull that back up. So the piccolo is kind of the secondary instrument for the flute. By secondary instrument, I mean that your flute players are also going to be the piccolo player. You will almost never find an orchestra that actually has a dedicated piccolo player where they play piccolo and that's all they play. Instead, the piccolo is used to kind of expand beyond the flute's register. Now, the piccolo's range goes from D5, which is the D of a little more than an octave above middle C. So you can see that this is middle C here. So if we go up an octave higher, we find that D5, and is that, I made a mistake. You know what, this, I don't know. I'm glad I noticed that. I need to change that. Piccolo range is wrong. Let me just make a note of that, sorry. All right, so I've got it correct on the staff here, but for some reason I didn't extend the shadow low enough for the piano keyboard, so I'm sorry for that mistake. But the piccolo's lowest note is right here. It's this D. Now, the nice thing about a MIDI performer is you can actually hear this register. Now, the one thing you don't see is I actually have my mod wheel maxed out right now. This is the loudest I can get this piccolo to sound. It's pretty quiet. And the reason why is because the piccolo's lowest register, which is about the lowest perfect fifth of its range, or a perfect fourth of its range, is an incredibly quiet register. And usually it's going to sound much more like this. Much, much quieter. And the reason why is it requires such carefully designed low air pressure to actually sound down here that you cannot possibly actually provide enough wind or breath pressure to actually play in this register and play loud. So this register, while it has a very soft, haunting, beautiful sound, it is incredibly weak. All right, and you will almost never find a practical use for this. Maybe sometimes if you want to double a very soft, intimate section, but the practical dynamic range of this is pianissimo to piano, which is just super soft to the loudest is soft. Now, the middle register is where we start to get into the G5 to C7 range. This is where things start to get a little brighter. A little brighter, a little cheerier, a lot more powerful, all right? So this is essentially from the G sharp at the top of the treble clef, so like this space right here, all the way up to the C sharp, an octave higher than high C. This is the preferred register for the piccolo. 9 times out of 10, when you write for the piccolo, it will be in this register. The main thing to keep in mind for that is this is a very high register. All right, you're not going to want to use it by default. You're only going to want to bring this in for specific reasons. By default, the most common reason to use the piccolo in this register is if you want to double a pre-existing line. Maybe you want to double a melody, maybe you want to double an ostinato, double something, and you want to add an octave higher to give it a little bit more power, a little bit more prominence. That's the chief role of the piccolo. Now, the final octave, like the C, 2 octaves above high C, all the way up, is the piccolo's highest register. And this is very shrill, very piercing, and a non-preferred register. In essence, this is exhausting for everybody involved. All right, if I were to spend any large amount of time up here, it very quickly becomes annoying to the audience if they have to listen to that for a long period of time, because it's a very shrill sound. Now, for the players, that requires a massive amount of air, a massive amount of breath, and it quickly becomes overwhelming and exhausting to your performers, especially if you expect them to play long pieces of music there. So when using this, it's typically saved for short bursts, where you want, say, like a quick run, like that, something very quick, something very sharp, short to help emphasize an idea, but you will very rarely ever find an actual full-blown melody or something placed in there. All right, so moving on, we have the flute. And actually, I'm realizing now it's already 3:20, so I'm going to kind of blaze through these a little bit. The next member of the flute family is the flute, naturally. It goes from C4 to D7. That's middle C to the D above high, about a little more than an octave above high C. So it also gets split into 3 registers. Unlike the piccolo, the lowest register of the flute is totally in-game. All right, you can totally use the lowest register of the flute. In fact, it is a very common preferred register for the instrument because it has a very kind of sweet, lyrical sound. This is kind of like your shire kind of music. It's very intimate, very rich. It is on the quieter side. The loudest it can play is about mezzo forte. So this is kind of saved for more intimate settings. But the next octave is really where things start to become a lot more lyrical. That almost sounded like the Shire theme. But it was, this is a lot more lyrical. This is where when you think of like melodic ideas in the flute, this is where they're typically going to be played. Beyond this, from high C and above, this is very rare for the flute. You're not going to hear it very often. You can spend short amount of time here, but honestly, this pretty much overlaps with the preferred register of the piccolo. So if you're going to spend any serious long periods of time in this register, it's better to just spend it on the piccolo than the flute. So moving on, we get into the single reeds, and we get to the clarinet. Clarinet is one of the most, if not the most melodic of the woodwind instruments. It has a range of the D3 to about B flat 6, I believe it is. D3 to B flat 6. That's the D below middle C to the B flat, almost an octave above high C. This range gets split into 4 registers. So first you have kind of this low register, all right, which is mostly the area below middle C. All right, so it's very dark, very rich, kind of sonorous sound is how it's often described. Then for about a minor third, right there, in concert music is kind of referred to as the weak middle register of the clarinet. Now, I should probably take a moment to explain something real quick. So if you're following along with these notes, you'll notice that some of the registers on each of these instruments are bold. Some of them are not. And I have a note earlier in the page that's saying when it's bold, it means this is a preferred register. When it's not bold, it means it's a non-preferred register. Now, the idea behind a non-preferred register isn't that you shouldn't spend any time in it or never use it, but the idea that is these are not really expressive. These aren't really emotional registers for the instrument. The talented musicians and trained musicians can perform in these registers, but you're not going to get the best performance out of them. And so, typically, if you are writing melodic material or any kind of important material, you want to avoid having any significant notes in a non-preferred register. So for the clarinet, you want to try and avoid having any long or significant moments in this minor third. Now, if you really want to, you could get away with it. More modern clarinets aren't as bad as traditional clarinets in this register, but tradition would dictate stick to the low register. After that, you get into the upper register, which is the vast majority of its range. And that's kind of the traditional sound that you would expect from a clarinet. Beyond that, we start to get into really squeaky, very shrill territories. And so, really, when you're writing for the clarinet, you want to try and stick in these primary areas. As a general tip, this isn't included in the lesson notes, so this is kind of just for you who are watching the stream and the video. The low register is preferred for the clarinet if it's playing part in the larger woodwind section. If you are using all the woodwinds, this low register is where the clarinet likes to spend most of its time. If you are not using most of the most of the woodwind section, and you want the clarinet to play a melody, this upper register is really where it's going to spend most of its time. All right, yes, and a breaking point. This is just for any of you who want to write music that will be played by a natural clarinetist. The note, the B flat and B just above middle C. So, this is called the breaking point on the clarinet. And it's very important to know that the finger positions for these two notes are starkly different and very difficult to navigate. So, professional players can move through there in like a scale or something just fine, but you really want to avoid fast, repetitive movement through here because it very quickly becomes unwieldy, very clumsy, and not very, it won't sound the way you want it to sound. So that's just a little something to be aware of. Moving on, we have the bass clarinet. Very similar to the regular clarinet, just moved down a bit. For like the sake of brevity, since you will have access to these notes afterwards, the one thing I'll say about the bass clarinet is it's one of two primary bass instruments for the woodwind family. Compared to the bassoon, which is the other one, the bass clarinet kind of has a somewhat softer sound. Whereas in the bassoon is going to have a much kind of harsher, heavier sound. So when you're trying to choose between which one to use, bass clarinet or bassoon, just remember the bass clarinet has a softer, more somber sound in its low register. The bassoon has a rougher, edgier, more powerful sound in its low register. And that makes sense, because if we talk about those three subsections we introduced earlier, the single reeds get more powerful the higher they go in their range. The double reeds, which the bassoon is, get more and more powerful the lower you get. In fact, one of the single most powerful instruments of the orchestra is the contrabassoon, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Now we get into the double reeds. The first one is the oboe. Oboe has a very limited range of usefulness. Essentially, the G above middle C to the F at the top of the treble clef is where the oboe has its most kind of traditional melodic sound. I don't know why I went up a tritone, but I did. But yeah, so the oboe is predominantly a melodic instrument. It's not usually going to be used to play harmonies, or it can be used to play accompaniment, but its primary role will be performing melodies. The English horn is your extension of the oboe. Just like how the piccolo has an upwards extension for your flute, the English horn, also known as the cor anglais, will be your lower extension for the oboe. And moving along, because again, you're going to have all these notes afterwards. The bassoon has a ridiculously massive range of B flat 1 to F5, which is the B flat below low C, all the way up to the F at the top of the treble clef. It has 3 registers, and they are all fair game. So let's actually spend a little bit of time on this one, switching over to that. The bassoon's lowest register is very thick, very heavy, very kind of raw, edgy sound. It's very useful for bass lines. Now, the middle register is where things start to get a little more interesting. This is a very expressive sound. And the unique thing about this register is it blends well with pretty much anyone. So you'll see here I describe it as being a harmonic and emotional chameleon. The reason why is, first, harmonic. The bassoon blends with pretty much every instrument you need it to blend with. So if you need to fill in a few voices in your accompaniment, but you don't want it to detract, say, you've got the French horns doing most of your accompaniment, but you need a few more voices, but you still want a very French horn dominant sound, bassoon is a perfect choice. You want a very cello dominant sound, but you need someone to help out. The bassoon is an excellent choice. Playing softly, it blends well with almost anyone without overshadowing them. The emotional chameleon is because the bassoon can perform pretty much any emotional experience you need. It can be dark, it can be menacing, it can be romantic, it can be tragic, it can be comedic. The bassoon can really do anything you need it to do. It's an unsung hero of the orchestra, and so really I can't recommend it enough. I love working with a bassoon. The upper register is pretty much everything on the treble clef. I don't know why I'm obsessed with tritones. I've started 2 things today with the tritone. It's a very dissonant sound. I wonder why I'm focused on it. But anywho, that's me getting off track. The upper register is almost strictly reserved for melodies. It's a very soft sound, a very pale sound. As you remember, as a member of the double-reeded family, the bassoon does get softer the higher it moves in its range, and more powerful and brutal the lower it gets in its range. So now the very last instrument we're going to kind of cover profile before we start talking about actually writing for the woodwinds is the contrabassoon. Now, the contrabassoon is one of the very true low voices of the orchestra. If you look at this chart, because so far, looking at that, all these charts have been correct except for the piccolo. I'm going to have to fix that piccolo. What you have is it goes almost all the way down to the complete bottom of the keyboard. There's only, the lowest note on the piano is A0, and that's literally the only note that the bassoon can't play below middle C. Now, the majority of its register is going to be from F1 to E2, which basically the E below low C. Let me find low C. I've got a small MIDI keyboard with me. So that's middle C. That's low C. Now let's switch to the contrabassoon. Oh no, spinning blue. Okay, there we go. Contrabassoon has basically the most useful register is going to be here to here. All right, so that's really where the contrabassoon is going to be used most of the time. This is where it's very powerful, very heavy. This is really when you have a bass line and you can't get it low enough. You really want a super heavy bass line. This is the kind of instrument that doubles the tuba an octave lower. All right, the contrabassoon is the king of the low end. And you'll notice I said you use the middle register for bass lines. It can go an entire tritone lower. Now, this is a super heavy register. All right, this is the kind of sound on an instrument that when it plays, it rattles the windows of the room it's being performed in. This is a ridiculously powerful, ridiculously overwhelming low sound. It's also very difficult to control. So this register is non-preferred, because even though it's so powerful and unique, it can become very quickly fatiguing to anyone who needs to listen to it. It very quickly wears out its welcome, and it can also very quickly get a very muddy sound. So you want to reserve it for kind of like special effects, when you just really want that one note or two that just shakes the room on the low end. All right, so with that was the speed run through just kind of like the profiles for each instrument. Like I said, I really recommend that you take some time to revisit each of those on your own, start committing those ranges, registers, and tone colors to memory. The big takeaway that I want you to have for the rest of this lesson, for now, just comes back to those initial notes. All right, so far, as we start to talk about writing for the woodwinds, keep in mind their greatest strength is their variability in tone colors. Keep in mind that they have 3 groups: the flutes, which are the flutes and piccolos, single reeds, which are the clarinets, and the double reeds, which is oboes and bassoons. And the important thing to remember about these 3 subsections: the flutes get more bright, more shrill, and more powerful the higher you move in their range. The single reeds also become more shrill and more powerful the higher you move in their range, but not as dramatically. And the double reeds are the exact opposite. The higher they move in their range, the softer they become, but the lower you move, the more heavy they become. Now, let's talk about writing for woodwinds in just a bit. But first, it looks like we got a bunch of comments. Let's see if there's any questions. Right. Can't wait to watch the vid. Can't stay. Just going to show me support. Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate it. Sean, awesome. A few ones like the Shinai sounds like a mega nasally oboe. The HNE has a sextuple reed section. Holy crap! All right, thank you, Sean. I'm excited. Okay, the Shinai. I gotta look that up. I'm gonna make a note for myself to look that up. Excellent. Thank you, Aditya. Back again. Welcome back, Aditya. Yes, English horn is the chatter oboe. English horn does have a heavier, more mature sound. I love working with the English horn. It can be a little tricky because you really need to be careful about your melodies you write for the English horn, just because it's at a disadvantageous range for for melodies, but it has an unrivaled emotional sound. Been following us and I'm having so much fun. Thank you. I'm so glad. I always get a little nervous talking about instrumentation because I really geek out about instrumentation, but I find that it doesn't tend to be as popular for some reason on YouTube. People love learning about how to write for different instruments, but they don't like learning about the instruments themselves, which is a shame because you really need to know the instruments if you want to know how to write for them. But awesome. So, as you know, the kind of rule to this, any questions you have, throw them in the chats. I am more than happy to get off topic and talk about anything music related. These notes are going to be available as soon as the stream is done. I'll download them as a PDF and add the link into the description of the video. But it looks like we don't have any more questions, so let's move on to the actual fun part, actually writing for the Woodwind section. And for this, there are really two golden rules of writing for Woodwinds. And it does not matter what role you are having your woodwinds play. It doesn't matter what music you are writing for your woodwinds. You should always follow these two golden rules unless for whatever reason you have a good reason not to. And the very first one is only use what you need. So kind of the knee-jerk reaction for most young orchestrators is that you need to use all the instruments all the time. There's this rampant belief that if you're not using an instrument, it must mean you don't know how to write for that instrument, and therefore you are revealing yourself as an amateur. And that could not be further from the truth. Remember, we talked about the greatest strength of the woodwinds being the sheer variety of tone colors you have at your disposal with this one section. However, if you're constantly using all of the woodwinds, you only have one tone color at your disposal, and that is the tone color of the entire woodwind section being used at the same time. So when you're working with the woodwinds, make sure you're only using what you absolutely need. If you have a part for the flute and a part for the oboe, fantastic. Don't throw in the other woodwinds unless you have a reason to. Don't throw them in because you feel guilty about not using them. Make sure you're being very purposeful. This is the golden rule of writing for woodwinds. Number 2 is always use registers of similar power across instruments. All right, so we talked about how each of these instruments have preferred and non-preferred registers. The main idea here is if your flutes are playing in a preferred register, all of your other woodwinds should also be played in a preferred register. If your flutes, or let's say your oboes, are playing in a non-preferred register, then all of your other instruments should be playing in a non-preferred register as well. If the oboes are playing in their lower end, that's where the oboes are super powerful, but they sound very rough. They sound kind of primal. They're not very pretty to listen to. You want to make sure that your other woodwinds are being used in a similar thing. And the whole point about this is about creating a clear sound, about creating a balanced sound. If your flutes are playing in a strong register, but your clarinets are playing in a weak register, you're going to have a very flute-dominant sound. Maybe that's what you want. But if you're looking for balance, if you're looking for clarity and to use all your instruments kind of to their strengths, you need to make sure that you're balancing. Now, like I said, it doesn't matter what you're writing, what genre, what style, what type of music, what layers you're working with. If you follow these two golden rules, for the most part, your music is going to work out well. That being said, there are 5 specific roles, or I should say traditional roles for the woodwinds, and that's what we're going to focus on learning today, is how to apply these 5 roles. All right, so there are 5 traditional roles for woodwinds. And the general idea here is that woodwind instruments, like any instrument, they can play anything you need them to play in the music, as long as it is physically possible for them to play. That being said, they do have traditional kind of idiomatic ways of being used. And the first one is doubling in unison. All right, so doubling in unison with, so let's say you have a single flute player doubling the first violins. It creates a very subtle impact on the overall color. All right, so in general, I will say flutes create a breathier sound. Clarinets create a more hollow and rich sound. The double reeds add more edge and sharp articulation to your cumulative sound. And then here's a little odd thing. We haven't talked about brass yet, but the French horns are also very often considered a woodwind instrument. And traditionally they were woodwinds. The French horns were the first brass instruments introduced to the orchestra. And for the longest time, there was no brass section. So, since there was no brass section, there was just the wind section, or the woodwinds. In which case, the French horns were included. And so when you use the French horns as a woodwind instrument, they're typically going to just kind of play slower, more held out notes. They create a more filled out and foundational sound. All right, so let's try playing around with a couple of these. So now we know we have this initial idea. You can hear my computer struggling. Let's see. Let's add an instrument here. I don't think I want to actually add one to the melody. The melody is nice and strong. I like the idea of a strong, clear melody. And since adding a single woodwind, because that isn't something else to keep in mind, the strings are viewed as sections. There's only one part written for violin 1, only one part written for violin 2. Doesn't matter how many violin players you have. Sometimes they might split into DVC, but it's still going to be one piece of sheet music. However, if you have 3 flute players, you are writing 3 different parts for the flutes. If you have 2 oboes, you're writing 2 different oboe parts. All the wind instruments are treated as individuals. That's not to say they can't play in unison. You can definitely have 3 flutes playing together at the same time, playing the same exact line. But for the most part, they will each have their own unique role. So I'm thinking, let's take a look at this first violin 2 roll. All right, let's look a bit closer. This is around the area of middle C. So the first thing we want to do is think about what kind of tone color we want. I kind of want a darker, kind of richer sound here. Then looking at what instrument can actually physically play this. There is one note, F, that goes into the undesirable middle register of the clarinet, but for the most part it stays right in the clarinet's low register. So I think I will just add this whole thing. In fact, you know what? Let's just copy the whole thing and put it in clarinets. Now we've got the clarinet playing. It works well. Now the important thing to keep in mind right here is I want you to notice how incredibly subtle this is. It doesn't have an overwhelming sound. If you didn't know to look for the clarinet, you probably wouldn't notice it. In fact, this is really bugging me that these aren't all starting at the same time. I thought it was my computer struggling, but yeah, I guess it's just my computer struggling. I thought there might have some. Let's look a bit closer, just double check. Yeah, because I thought we quantized these. Yeah, these are all quantized. I don't know what's going on. But since we've got this, I also think I'm just going to double it. I'm going to assume I have multiple clarinets here. I like the sound of the clarinet there, so I am just going to go here to the clarinets. I'm going to pop in the second one. Make sure it actually works. The lowest note on a clarinet is down here. This is why it's important to know the ranges of your instruments so you can see what's physically possible. And yeah, this should work well. Let's make sure that my sound library is set on long so to actually play multiple notes. Let's play it solo first. Then we'll unsolo it. And right now I have to fight the urge to just keep working on this and experimenting and finding other roles to do for these clarinets and see what my other options are, because right now I know we have 4 other roles to fill out. All right? And this is not about me orchestrating something live. This is about me teaching how to use the woodwinds. And I have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, I'll get sidetracked. All right, so the second role is enhancing other instruments. All right, so we've talked about doubling in unison. That is to kind of create a different color, but this enhancing other instruments is very similar to doubling, but it is a almost kind of unique second skill. So we've got things like doubling in octaves to add power. So we talk about how doubling in unison is primarily a color-based decision. If you're doubling in octaves, the role you are filling out creates a much more powerful sound. We've already kind of experimented with that over here in the second part. We'll see that the violins 1 and violin 2, we branch out in the melody here from 1 octave to 2 octaves. All right, so let's actually right now demonstrate this by, we will take this, zoom in, where is that? And if we're going to be doubling an octave higher than the violins, my gut reaction says flute will work. Let's take a look. This is the C above middle C. So here we go. Yeah. What we have is the flute playing in its low register for the most part. It peaks up a little bit, and the registers aren't written in stone. It's more like a spectrum. It gradually blends from one register to the other. And if you remember, talking about the flute's lowest register, it creates a very good, yes, I've got that checked. So that it creates a very kind of lyrical sound quality, very rich, intimate sound. I love that sound. And so now what we have is, well, that's in the first violin. Oh, I shouldn't have looked, because now I want it to keep it in that register. But we're not talking about doubling in unison at the moment. We are talking about doubling in octave. So if we move it up an octave, what we do now is we are doubling the melody. The melody was previously in just 1 octave. It was 1 line. Now it's being played in 2 octaves. Lowest octave is by the violins. They are by far much more powerful than a single flute. The flute's going to have a subtle effect, but it is embellishing it by making the melody take up more space across the full range, the full spectrum of sound. The melody now, instead of taking up 1 octave, takes up 2 octaves. And because of that, it's going to have a much more powerful, much more prominent sound. So if we listen to this, we'll see the kind of subtle impact. Now, another way that you can do kind of embellishing, because embellishing or enhancing isn't just enhancing, but you can also embellish other lines by adding / removing notes. So this is something that's going to be used later in music. You'll rarely ever use an embellishment on the first time you hear a melody. But if we wanted to, we could say these first 2 measures. We're going to take our initial notes, we are going to shorten them, and then we're going to fill in the space in between. All right, so actually, instead of shortening, I'm going to cut them in half. And I'm essentially leaving the original notes alone, but adding a bit of filler in between. So let's make this a little more scalar movement. And then do 1 leap. So now we've got... And then we can take this original note. We'll leave the start just alone. We won't do anything to it. But now we're going to continue this scalar movement. We're going to move it up. And in fact, let's just solo the flute and the first violin so we can hear how it's technically the same idea, but now it's a little embellished. You're adding extra notes to it. This is an incredible strategy for growth. It's one of my go-to uses for the flute, actually, is to take a pre-existing layer of your music, typically the melody, and basically embellish it using the flute an octave higher. It creates more movement, creates a more lush, more vibrant, more kind of rich texture to your sound. And that is essentially part number 2 for the Woodwinds, is doing one of those two things, essentially. Doubling in octaves. Remember, doubling in octaves gives power. Embellishing it by playing the same thing but adding additional notes, or removing notes and playing a simplified version, help add kind of depth to your sound. All right, before moving on to the third use, it looks like we got quite a few comments. Best composing lesson I've ever seen. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much, FB. Vivek, hello, sir. Wonderful. Good to see you, Vivek. Awesome. One of the OGs of the channel. Caleb Williams. This really is turning into a beautiful romantic melody. It really is, isn't it? Jack did an amazing job with this. After the first lesson, when people said they wanted to do orchestration, I was so swamped. I asked one of my students, I really asked the channel. I asked, does anyone want to just write an 8-bar melody for me? And one of my students, Jack, really came in clutch and wrote this for me. And it's been a lot of fun working with this. And it kind of takes the pressure off me having to worry about something I wrote myself. So excellent work, Jack. Thank you. Let's see here. Aditya, can you tell how to find the sounds of woodwinds in any arrangements? So I'm assuming you're wondering about listening to music and trying to pinpoint which woodwinds are being used. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut for that. You just need to start becoming very familiar with the actual sounds of each woodwind. Listen to music written for each instrument. Try looking up solos for clarinet, solos for flute, looking at music that features these instruments. The more familiar you become with the instruments, the more you can try and tell your brain, all right, is there a flute playing right now? And really kind of try to zone in on that sound. But in lots of arrangements, it can be very difficult to even pinpoint subtle things. So the best option is if you have sheet music or access to a MIDI breakdown. Other than that, it's just unfortunately a matter of time and experience. I wish I had a shortcut for you. All right, Caleb, listen for the more air-driven sounds. When their purpose is to blend in, it can be very difficult to hear. Very true. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Caleb. Great tip. Sean Gilbert, heterophony moment. Yes. That's referring to different kinds of textures you can find in orchestration. If you aren't familiar with different kinds of textures, like the heterophonic texture, which is what Sean, I believe, is referring to, polyphonic textures, polythematic textures, Ryan Leach, an incredible music channel on YouTube, has a playlist on orchestral textures that I cannot recommend enough. He goes in depth on the 7 textures recommended by George McKay in his book Creative Orchestration, which I have around here somewhere. Unfortunately, not within reach, but is an incredible book on orchestration. It's a rare book. It's difficult to find. I had to track one down at a library, like an hour away from my home, because there's no way I could afford the book yet. But if you can get your hands on a copy, it's a very useful book. And at the moment, you can find all that information on Ryan Leach's channel. Let's see here. I took some Udemy classes and read books, but I cheated with learning instrumentation by using the spectratone chart. It basically classifies tone color and suggestions. Groups of colors. Yes. Oh, Sean, that is a very, very easy trap to fall into. Is just the list of what instruments pair well together. I think I have a video on blending instruments and how to find good pairings in my orchestration playlist. But if that's something you guys would be interested in learning more about, is how to find the right instrument to play the right part, or the right sound for the right emotion or something, I can do a live stream about that as well at some point, or maybe just a full video. Last one, also Sean, I just hope I'm not shooting myself in the foot. Yes. You're not shooting yourself in the foot. The information is useful, but it is limiting. All right, I find it's much more liberating to understand a handful of good principles about what makes a strong decision than having to rely on what other people have told you actually works. Being able to create the right combination for the right piece of music is incredibly important. skill set to have. So I would recommend trying to not rely on it too much. But that's getting caught up in the comments. As usual, if you have any questions, throw them in the comments. For now, I'm going to move right along. And the third of the 5 traditional roles for the Woodwinds is functioning as a group. And this is essentially the same 3-group process we learned in the string video. All right, so this was the stream I did 2 days ago. We learned about a 3-group process. In fact, let's solo. We've got the clarinet and flute right now. I'm going to drop the flute. Actually, I'm going to delete the flute, sad as that is. I'm going to highlight the violin again. I'm going to drop that, and what we have is the flute and the clarinets now. And what we have here is we have 2 groups of our 3-group model. We talked about how we have one of the groups is your melody group, essentially, or your non-harmony group. Whatever group is playing a melody, an ostinato, an arpeggio, something that's not chords related. A second group is your closed group, which basically plays the chord tones that are not present in your bass group. And the bass group is essentially the low voice. So we've got clarinet. Let's just stick to the clarinets. Let's not bring in any double reeds. We'll add the bass line into the clarinets, and what we have is our 3 groups. We have group 1 is your bass line. Why is that all the way over here? I thought that, that's why. All right, so we have our first group, which is our bass line. This might be a little low. What is it? So C3 is middle C and Q bass. No, yeah, this is perfectly within range for the instrument. So we've got group 1 is your bass line. It either plays the bass line by itself or in octaves across 2 or more instruments. Group 2 is your chords. Essentially, the chordal tones not found in your melody or bass line. You can have full-blown chords here if you want here. And then the third one is your melody. And the important thing is to make sure that none of them are overlapping. But this just goes to show that the Woodwinds are more than capable of holding their own as a section. Now, all of this automation down here was written for the cello, so this isn't kind of too idiomatic for the section. But the main idea here is using the same exact guidelines we had earlier for those 3 groups. The Woodwinds can very easily hold their own. Now, the most common use for using the Woodwinds to play either an entire section by itself or just most of a section by itself is usually contrast. Again, this has to deal with just the sheer amount of variety. Let's say you've got a very strong string dominant section in the music. Let's say actually in this music, we have a nice subtle kind of woodwinds and strings thing going on. Then we have a very climactic moment with the strings. Maybe after this we want to repeat the same exact idea, but we want something new. So instead of using any strings at all, we just do the woodwinds, playing the whole idea, the theme, chords, and bass line. Maybe throwing some cello in there just to play a soft bass line to help give a little more presence, a little more cohesive nature to the music. But really, the main takeaway here is, yes, you can use that strategy we learned for strings on the woodwinds, and they can hold their own quite beautifully. Now, the fourth role is adding excitement, if I can type. Excitement, and I forgot an E. Excitement and energy, all right? So the woodwinds are kind of the the king of what you call ear candy. Ear candy are kind of all those embellishments. They're the little add-ons, the things that aren't necessary, but they are so, so good. These are kind of the most typical types of ear candy are trills and runs. All right, so a run is essentially just a scale. All right, so we've got this big climactic moment. That's right, the strings are off. So now let's add a run to all of this, and we'll add it in the flute section, because the flutes and clarinets are kind of like the kings of runs. All you got to do is understand what your chords are. What we're going to do is our first chord is an F major 7, is we're going to pick our first note. I don't want it to go too high in the flute, so I'm going to say, let's just pick a C. All right, and then I think my last note is also going to be a C. We'll see, I might have to change that. But basically, for a run, you pick a starting note, you pick an ending note, and more importantly, you pick their location. All right, I want my starting note to be at the beginning of the measure. I want my ending note to be at the end of the measure. I could have changed that. I could have said I want my start note to be at the start of this measure and my last note to be the end of 4 measures later. You're more than welcome to do that, but the idea is you just want to start with that first note and that last note. And all you need to do is bridge them together. So I see that's coming down a bit. Let's actually do one of these. We'll kind of do a cascading run. And then, yeah, just give this a listen. And then we just kind of, what's the next chord? Is G major. So easy. Yeah, just start with the B. We start with the B. Last note we'll say is also B. And we just kind of follow the pattern. There's a small leap at the end, but it's not that important. Oh, there's not a leap. Oh yeah, there is. I just skipped here. And the idea is the whole point of a run is people start to get freaked out about how to write an actual run. It's not that difficult. You pick a start, you pick an end point, and you find a way to connect the two. Now, it could be I decide these 16th notes at a tempo of 80 BPM are just too slow. So maybe I decide I want to do 30-second notes. And I shorten all of these and make it much faster. Whatever we want to do. The main idea is if we play this by itself, it's not a very musical idea. I mean, it's musical, but it's not very melodic. It's not an important idea. Its whole responsibility is to just add energy, just to add a little extra flair to the sound. And the clarinets and flutes are both incredibly agile instruments. They can move incredibly quickly. The double reeds aren't as agile. Typically, if we did something like this, we would do a simplified version in the oboes. So maybe instead of 16th notes, it'd be like C, then down to A. And we'd be going based off like quarter notes, or eighth notes. Why is it not lining up? And the oboe would just kind of move a little bit slower, but still hit the same notes at the same beats. If you'll notice, C lines up with C, A lines up with A, B lines up with B, G lines up with G, etc., etc. That's what you would kind of do with the double reeds in that situation. But again, the whole point of this is just to add energy. Another common strategy is to use trills. So you identify important notes. Maybe that's an important note in the melody or an important note in a counter melody or the harmony or something. You identify that note. You play that same exact note in, say, the flutes. Maybe, I don't know, maybe an octave higher or an octave lower if you're playing a low woodwind. You hit a trill, and you just play it. Maybe you go up here. You play these different notes. You just kind of add a little bit of trill. There are 2 types. You can do a minor second trill, a major second trill. And the main idea is that you're just playing the same exact note, but you're adding a little flair to it. This isn't something that takes a lot of time or a lot of energy. It's just, again, these are extras. And the Woodwinds are the kings of extras. They are the kings of ear candy, is what it's called. Now, the last one is called, the last role is creating background textures. So, this is very, very close, very closely related, very similar to the fourth role. All right, the main difference here is adding ostinati and arpeggios as extra layers. Now, the run we were talking about earlier, this one in particular was a little odd. This is more of an ostinato than anything else. If you haven't seen my video on ostinati, An ostinato is a short repeating rhythmic idea. This is kind of a short repeating rhythmic idea. We've got a shape to it. Most traditional runs would be much more just like following a straight line down, possibly turning around and moving back up again. But the idea is most runs don't have ups and downs. They don't have shapes like that. They consist of just straight lines. An ostinato can be a lot crazier. It can be a lot more over the place. An arpeggio is very similar to an ostinato. It just sticks closely to just chordal tones. The main idea of those layers is, again, how do I put this? All right, so the main difference between 4 and 5 is number 4 basically embellishes something that exists already or adds a short little idea. So the trills embellish something that exists already. The runs are typically used to lead into a moment. All right, so I talked about picking your starting and ending point. The ending point of a run is typically a significant moment in the melody. All right, let's say that we've got these violins down here. Let's say this D right here. We decide this is the important note. In the flutes, we just create a quick run up and then maybe back down. And the whole point is we're doing a quick scale that bam ends here on D. Here it's not really a scale. It's more just moving by note. The idea is you have a very quick movement that very clearly ends at this moment. An ostinato or an arpeggio kind of exist more for themselves. So if we were to take this idea, so I suppose you could say the difference between the two is a run is essentially this one idea. Used once, that's that. Now, if it repeats like this, maybe with some differences, but it repeats for a long period of time, that's an arpeggio, or if it's only chordal tones, or it's an ostinato if it's not only chordal tones. And the point of an ostinato or an arpeggio is it kind of exists as its own unique layer. A run or a trill are used to lead up to a specific moment to emphasize it in the melody. I hope that wasn't too confusing, because I did kind of write more of an arpeggio, or more of an ostinato than a run that first time, and I am very sorry if that was confusing to some people. But those are essentially, where'd my notes go? Those are the 5 rolls. All right, and for when you're writing for the Woodwinds, of course you can do other things. But if you are going to just kind of speed write something, or you want to make sure that you're writing something that for sure is going to sound good or sound idiomatic, you might run into that word in other YouTube videos or orchestration books. Idiomatic, writing idiomatically essentially just means you are writing in a way for that instrument that you are expected to write. So that if you have a flute player and they've never seen the music before, but they need to record it for you right now, it seems like basic, usual, typical flute music. That's writing idiomatically. If you are writing something and you've got little mistakes here and there, or you've written something particularly difficult, that it's not because you wanted something difficult, but because you didn't realize it was difficult, that's the issues of not writing idiomatically. So this right here is essentially your guide to writing idiomatically. And how many times can I say that word in a row? I'm sorry, I'm all over the place today. But yeah, so these 3 things to keep in mind. The first one are the 3 sections, the 3 subsections of the Woodwinds and their tendencies. The second one is the 2 golden rules of writing for Woodwinds. Above all, these are the most important things to keep in mind. And then finally, the 5 traditional rules. This is the most useful information, I think. With that, wow, okay, yeah, we're over time already. I didn't realize it was already 4:08. I've got work I got to get done. Any questions? I'll stay on for a little bit longer. We'll listen to the music. Yeah, that's what we'll do. All right, we'll listen to the music one more time. And while we're listening to the music, I will wait for people to post questions in the comments. Once the music's done, I'll answer all the questions that I can before signing off. All right, so here we go. That's my bad. I've still got the flute soloed. right. Excellent. Let's see. So the first question, Aditya, I think here the strings are overlapping the flute. All right, I'm not sure what moment you were talking about because that was probably when I was doing all the stuff over here and I didn't see your comment on time. Sorry about that, Aditya. But that does bring up a very important part. So, important point. So in the last video, the last stream, and a little bit in this one, I really stressed the idea that your layers should have their own registers. Your melody should have its own little range. And it doesn't overlap with the accompaniment, which doesn't overlap with the bass line. I really stressed that as being super important. And I even gave a demonstration when I accidentally overlapped the melody and chords myself about how when two differing ideas are in the same space, they're going to neutralize each other. They're going to hurt each other. So it's not like can't hear them, but you're going to lose clarity. They're not going to stick out as well. And really, that is an important issue. But the main idea is this doesn't refer to instruments. This refers to layers. So the flute and the violin can overlap each other if they are both playing the same basic idea. So if we look these in, we'll see if we were to drop, they're still separate because it's an octave, but if we were to drop this, they look ostensibly like different ideas. They have a different shape at the very beginning. But they're still the same idea. This is the melody. This is the melody, slightly embellished. It is perfectly fine to have different instruments or even parts overlap each other, just so long as they belong to the same layer, the same idea. If they don't, say if the flutes were playing an ostinato, or just a different idea other than the melody, and I did have them overlapping the melody, that would be an issue, because then it would be harmful to the clarity of the arrangement. And clarity is very important for orchestration. It's what makes an orchestration sound clean and professional. One of many things that makes it sound clean and professional. So I hope that helps clarify if there was any confusion. Mattia, if you say idiomatically 3 times in a row, Howard Shore will appear and slap you. I like that. I'm a huge Howard Shore nerd. I think the thing I identify with him the most is just how much prep time he does for his themes. He spent 4 months, it was either 4 or 6 months, studying the stories of Lord of the Rings before he wrote any music. He read different translations. He read different versions that had like annotations. He read everything he could about like Celtic, Aramaic, Arabic, all these different philosophies that mythologies that he could possibly get his hands on that were potentially related to the different cultures in Lord of the Rings. Did everything he could to get all the information he could find, and then he started writing music. That's very similar to my own approach, as you may have noticed if you watched my film scoring series that I did recently. But yes, I tend to get stuck in loops where I repeat things a lot, so. Caleb, next stream you might as well do the brass section. The brass, if you can't tell, I love a good brass section. Yes! Oh, I agree. The brass is by far the best section. And that's not just because I'm a trumpet player. But, yeah, definitely. If that's what you guys are interested in, I can do the brass section next Tuesday, or this Tuesday, I suppose it would be. As a reminder, I plan on doing 2 streams a week for the remainder of September. Typically, according to the new schedule I'm trying to follow, Thursdays every week are supposed to be dedicated to more of a typical longer video. But the current series I've been doing, basically the Hollywood cliche videos, are very time consuming because I need to write a new piece of music for every single one of them. I need to arrange the piece of music, then I need to write the script, then I gotta record the audio, then I gotta then I do all the editing. It's very time consuming, and I realized I just didn't have time for it for this month. So this month, the streams are much shorter for me. They're much less effort, and I enjoy them. So I'll be doing 2 a week this month. And in October, that's when the typical Thursday videos will make a return. And those are the videos I typically make shout-outs to my patrons. So if you are a patron and I haven't given you a shout-out yet, sorry about that. At the moment, I'm only doing streams and short videos. The moment the longer videos are back, I will definitely be giving you a shout-out. But with that, it looks like that's the end of our questions. If there are any other topics you'd like to see me cover in a future live stream, leave them in the comments. I'm always looking for things to discuss. interesting ideas. I'll be doing the brass probably on Tuesday. But other ideas I think we came up with in this lesson was how to find the right instrument to play specific roles in your music, like how to decide the right sound for your melody, etc., etc. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know. But for now, I am going to sign off. So I will see you all in the next stream. Hope you learned something from this. All right. Have a good one, all of my friends. All right. See you.